I talked about with the Cleveland Browns draft grade video that there are certain organizations that are fun to kind of make fun of because they create their own situations. And that is definitely true, and it definitely holds true to me for the Cleveland Browns. But I hope someday they actually right the ship and figure it out so that way those long suffering fans in Cleveland can have something to actually cheer for. But then there are also those instances in the different sports leagues here in North America where I feel the league is at its best when certain teams are good or really good, whether that be based off of the history of that organization. Maybe like in baseball, you have the New York Yankees, the LA Dodgers, the Boston Red Sox. There are those certain teams that when they're good, the rest of baseball is better off as a whole as a result. Same thing with the NFL. When a team like the San Francisco 49ers or the Dallas Cowboys or maybe the Pittsburgh Steelers, when teams like that have a tradition, a history with a national fan base are doing well, the sport as a whole is elevated even more. And when it comes to the NFL, one of those teams that to me fit into that category of the league is always better off when this team is good, either because there are so many fans across the country that love them or so many fans across the country that hate them, and that is, of course, the Oakland Raiders. And it's been very sad to see over the past decade or so a once proud franchise that stood for the greatness of the Raiders and excellence and championships and all of that has now been reduced to being an also ran organization, a doormat organization, if you will. It's very sad to see. And I think it does hurt the NFL that one of their marquee franchises has been terrible the past decade. It's really bad. And when you talk about that poor run over the past decade, really since the end of the 2002 season, that Super Bowl loss to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, an organization's never been the same. Al Davis built that team to win and win now. They ultimately didn't win the biggest prize, and then the bottom kind of fell out. And Al Davis, let's face it, he is the Raiders. He was the Raiders, but it's a good thing for the Raiders ultimately long term that he's no longer around because he was running that organization into the ground 6 feet under the ground, which is where he ultimately ended up. I know it sounds kind of crass and I sound like an ass for saying it, but by God, that's the truth. And when you look at the draft position in the first round before any trades or anything else since 2005, based on the finish in the regular season of the Oakland Raiders, here you go. Number 7, number 7, number 1, number 4, number 7, number 8, 17, 17, 3, and 5. So between the 2005 NFL draft and this year's 2014 NFL draft, the Oakland Raiders have had a total of 8 top 10 picks, similar to the Cleveland Browns, and also had 4 picks out of those 8 in the top 5. Just think about that for a second. But Oakland kind of took the stupidity to a whole different level. It wasn't just, missing on first round picks and consistently repeating the same mistakes. They went above and beyond the Cleveland Browns and their stupidity by trading away first round picks for veterans over the years. That number 7 pick they had in 2005, they traded away to get Randy Moss. That number 17 pick in 2011, they traded away to get Richard Seymour. That number 17 pick in 2012, they traded away to get Carson Palmer. Just think about that for a second. They brought in a Randy Moss when they didn't have a quarterback to get him the ball. They didn't have a good team around him, and they knew he could potentially be a problem. They traded a top 10 pick to get him as part of a package to get him. The number 17 pick in 2011 to get a Richard Seymour who was past his prime, and the number 17 pick in 2012 to get a Carson Palmer in the 2011 season, who again was past his prime, and an organization that was nowhere near the position of being ready to contend for a championship. And you look at some of the picks that they've made over the years when they have kept him. Taking Michael Huff 7th overall in 2006, oopsie daisies. Jamarcus Russell, number 1 overall in 2007. In that talented draft, they passed on guys like Megatron and Joe Thomas and Adrian Peterson and Patrick Willis and Marshawn Lynch to get Jamarcus Russell. Oopsie daisies. Not good. And then you look at Darren McFadden, 4th overall in 2008. Darius Hayward-Bay, number 7 overall in 2009. Rolando McClain in 2010. Hell, I'll throw DJ Hayden already into that mix. Their 12th overall selection in 2013. A lot of misses with those first round picks. And even if you want to remove Hayden from the picture because it's too soon to say he's a bust, or a miss, that's fine. But there's still a lot of history of bad choices and bad decisions made with those first round picks over the past decade or so, between trading them away from veterans when it didn't make sense to do so, or taking the wrong players when it didn't make sense to do so. And when you talk about the Cleveland Browns and their instability at the top at the head coaching position, this is where you definitely feel the legacy of Al Davis towards the end of his life, towards the end of his reign as the Raiders owner. You talk about 5 head coaches since the 2005 season: Norv Turner, Art Shell, Lane Kiffin, Tom Cable, Hugh Jackson, Dennis Allen. Is now the 6th, actually. Think about that for a second. The 6th head coach since the beginning of the 2005 season. It's no surprise the Raiders found themselves picking in the top 5 again in 2014. So now that Al Davis is no longer in the fold, his son Mark Davis is running the show. Reggie McKenzie is the general manager. And really, what Reggie McKenzie, I feel, has done over the past couple of years has been really building up to this moment, building up to this year, this offseason, and this draft. He cleared out a ton, and I emphasize again, a ton of salary cap space to get ready for 2014, to maybe bring back the greatness of the Raiders. But if initially you were looking for Reggie McKenzie to do something great and you were a Raiders fan or just an outside observer, you were hugely disappointed, but maybe not all that surprised. They had this tremendous amount of cap space, but failed to utilize the franchise tag on 2 of their best players who were both hitting free agency at the same time. That was left tackle Jared Veldheer and then defensive end Lamar Houston. They allowed both of them to go in free agency for absolutely nothing. And you could sit there and say maybe these guys wanted to go and maybe it was this and maybe it was that. Well, that's why you implement the usage of the franchise tag. Why would you allow both of these guys to leave the fold for nothing? Why would you allow them to leave when you are already an organization lacking in talent, where you could at least ensure yourself of keeping one of them for one more season and maybe seeing what you got from there? And he did nothing. He let Veldheer go to the freaking Arizona Cardinals. He let Lamar Houston go to my Chicago Bears. And then to top things off, Reggie McKenzie sits there and attempts to downgrade the offensive line position by bringing in Roger Saffold and giving him more than Veldheer money to play at a level below Jared Veldheer. That makes absolutely no sense except when you look at it from the Oakland Raiders standpoint. And then, of course, Mark Davis wisely vetoed that deal, said nix that deal, said, nuh-uh, he didn't pass his physical. This is ridiculous. This is getting out of control. And it was at this point in time, I'm like, oh, my God. The Raiders are already in contention for the number 1 overall pick in the 2015 NFL Draft. I mean, it was looking that bad based off of the past decade, really. And then what they were doing in the offseason, it's like, what the fuck are you doing? But then the second wave of free agency hit. They signed guys like Tuck. They signed guys like Woodley. They signed guys like, I believe, Maurice Jones-Drew. They made the trade for Matt Schaub. They signed James Jones. They re-signed Charles Woodson. So they brought in some nice pieces, Terrell Brown. They brought in some veterans, which isn't necessarily a formula for great long-term success, I will grant you that. But they did a much better job of addressing some of their needs and upgrading in some areas on a very limited talent roster, that the Oakland Raiders have. So with that being said, I was at least a little more optimistic that maybe Reggie McKenzie was learning from his mistakes and would do a better job in the 2014 NFL Draft. Wasn't fully sold because I still wasn't that big of a fan of what they did in free agency, but I'm like, just maybe, we'll see what they do. And I give credit where credit is due. The Oakland Raiders, to me, were one of the big winners in the 2014 NFL Draft. Hats off to Reggie McKenzie, Mark Davis, Dennis Allen, that entire Oakland Raiders organization for really delivering one of the best on-point drafts 2 weekends ago. I mean, it really, really was. For the Oakland Raiders, they sat there over the years and a lot of times will gamble on speed and upside and physical tools instead of just sometimes, frankly, looking at whether or not a guy could play and whether or not a guy should be drafted where the fuck they were getting ready to draft him. You look at the guys like the DJ Haydens. You go back, Darius Hayward-Bay, Jamarcus Russell, Michael Huff. These are guys that they reached on and in some cases reached really big on, all because they had this or they had that, and they ignored the fact maybe of whether or not they could play. Well, once the Jacksonville Jaguars took Blake Bortles, number 3 overall, it ends up working out where the Oakland Raiders could sit there at pick number 5 and perhaps take the best defensive player, if not one of the best 2 players in this, or 3 players in this entire 2014 NFL Draft at number 5 in Khalil Mack, the outside linebacker from Buffalo. The Oakland Raiders won by not getting cute, by not outthinking themselves. They just got the hands down best player available, not named Teddy Bridgewater, on the board at that point. They got an impact defensive player that could potentially be the face of their defense, the face of their franchise, maybe even for the next 8 to 10 years, all by staying put and doing nothing. They didn't gamble, they didn't reach, they didn't do anything spectacularly stupid. They said, no, you know what? This kid can really play and he could really fit our system. And the reason I emphasize that, it was because in round 2, they were able to stay put and have Derek Carr, the quarterback from Fresno State, a guy that they obviously had a very big heart on in that Raiders organization, instead of the old Raiders way and the old temptation where they maybe would have traded down a few slots, maybe they would have traded down with Buffalo, or maybe they would have traded down to where Detroit was and then taken Derek Carr then and had it be a tremendous reach for need. They took the best player available, not named Teddy Bridgewater, at number 5, and then in round 2 followed that up by getting a quarterback that they really liked. In the past, they would have sat there and taken him high in the top 10 in round number 1. Instead, they didn't. They played the game. They waited it out. They followed the board, and then he was there at number 36, and they jumped all over him. And then what I really like is that Reggie McKenzie traded out of his pick at the high portion of round 3 to be able to get a lower third and an additional 4th round pick and be able to use those picks on guys like Gabe Jackson, who helps improve the interior of that offensive line, the offensive guard. Keith McGill, the corner from Utah that fits that new mold kind of the bigger physical bump and run press cover corner. I like the pick of Justin Ellis, Shelly as you might call him, the 4th round pick out of Louisiana Tech, the defensive tackle. I really, really like what the Raiders did here. And also you throw into the fact that they traded a 6th round pick to get a guy like Matt Schaub to be their starter in 2014. People could say what they want about Matt Schaub, but Matt Schaub was not the only reason that the Houston Texans went 2-14 in 2013. And rest assured that Matt Schaub is still a big upgrade for the Oakland Raiders over anything else that they trotted out there at starting quarterback in 2013 or over the past few years, to be quite honest. And yes, that would even include Carson Palmer. I went there. I threw that out there. And they gave up a 6th round pick to get him. So Reggie McKenzie, to me, did a really solid job of understanding how to play it out and let the game happen of the draft. Go for best available player. Trade down to accumulate additional picks and additional currency. Use some of that currency to make a move here or there. But nothing ridiculous. A safe draft. And I think a really productive, good draft. Their best pick to me, obviously, is easily Khalil Mack from Buffalo. I think he's a big-time defender for a decade in the NFL. Their best value maybe is a guy like Keith McGill, the corner out of Utah, guy that I had a late 2nd to early 3rd round grade on. They're able to get right smack dab in the middle of the 4th round. A Raider type of pick, a guy with some off-the-field issues, but a guy with size, physicality, that fits kind of that Raider mold. A guy that could surprise, though, would be Justin Ellis, their 4th round pick out of Louisiana Tech. I think he's a guy that could play in a couple of different spots on the inside in that defensive line, and I think he's a guy that could surprise some people, especially as part of a defensive tackle rotation early on in his career. The only thing I would second guess is maybe Derek Carr. I'm not a huge Derek Carr guy, and I'm wondering if you're the Oakland Raiders, if you would have been maybe better suited to move up into pick 30 or maybe 31 or a little bit higher to maybe get your hands on either Manziel or more particularly Teddy Bridgewater. I don't want to totally prune him for taking Derek Carr because, again, this is a guy a couple of years ago that they would have sat there and found a way to take in the top 10, or they would have just sat there at number 5 and taken this F the world. But they took him at least in round number 2. I'm just wondering if he was the best quarterback for them. Now, in terms of my final grade for the Oakland Raiders, I gave him a B+. I think Mack is going to be a decade-long cornerstone of that Oakland Raiders defense. A safe type of pick. The trade down in round 3 was very well done to get yourself a little bit lower of a 3rd round pick and still get your guy in Gabe Jackson and then be able to accumulate an additional 4th round pick to get a guy like Keith McGill, using a 6th round pick before the draft to get a guy like Matt Schaub. Was also very well done. This was a very sensible, safe, value-based draft for the Oakland Raiders, and I was surprised and pleasantly surprised at that. The one kind of cautionary tale I will give everybody is about 4 years ago, a lot of people around football were praising the Oakland Raiders and what they did in the 2010 draft, because instead of taking a Bruce Campbell, at number 8, it got him in the 4th round. That would have been an Al pick, and somebody locked Al in the room and skippity skip and whoop-de-woo. how much contribution did they really get out of that safe class, that sensible class, that this is a really good draft class out of the Raiders? Their first round pick, Rolando McClain, complete bust, obviously. Second round pick, Lamar Houston, good player, now out of the organization. Fourth round pick, Jacoby Ford, okay player, out of the organization. Bruce Campbell, physical talent, out of the organization. It was a sensible draft that really didn't provide much for the Oakland Raiders long term. And my concern is that the 2014 draft in some ways is being viewed as a little bit like that draft. But I do think on the surface the Raiders did a much better job. McKenzie and his staff and his crew did a much better job of working the draft, understanding how the draft process is supposed to work. And I think beyond question they did a good job of upgrading the Raiders organization's talent at least a little bit, if not more than a little bit, with this 2014 NFL draft.